Hi, let's embroider a medieval dog with me. We'll start with the inspiration behind the dog, which is this 12th century church in Herefordshire. There's a few reasons for this, which I will discuss throughout the video, as there are some areas where we have large amounts of embroidery going on without much to say specifically about the embroidery. So this is a dog that I'm trying to copy. We start with the basic outline of the dog using chalk. I always draw on the wrong side, despite the fact that chalk does rub off. In fact, I do struggle with this a bit later on, which we shall see. I don't know why I always do this. Having done the outline in chalk, we move on to the embroidery. We're following along the outline using yellow wool and a backstitch. I've inherited the wool I'm using, so I don't know the exact dye stuff. I suspect it's likely an exhaust bath of weld. It's slightly darker than my own exhaust weld that I later use as a form of shading, but otherwise it's a very close match. The reason for using yellow here is I've been given the heraldic colours of blue, white and yellow to work with, and the crest was for a white dog. The yellow provides a contrast to the blue, while the use of paler yellow helps it not stand out too much from the white dog. So I'm making this for a friend in Hereford who does 12th century Norman reenactment, hence my choice of a local church for inspiration. A lot of medieval embroidery seems to have been inspired by manuscripts, and it has also been suggested that these artists who made the manuscripts probably directly made the embroidery, which was then made by embroiderers. We do a quick redraw of the face in chalk as the outline got rubbed out, and it's back to finishing the outline of the dog with the yellow thread. I personally like to take inspiration from stonework, particularly for lower ranking embroidery, because if you're a low ranking person doing a bit of embroidery, you're probably more likely to see it in stone than in a manuscript. This is for a higher ranking garment, but as the stonework is a local Hereford style, I figure that's quite a good way to get inspiration and bring in that local tie. If you're working with a more low rank garment, you'd probably go for something a bit simpler and a bit more time efficient. Unfortunately, my camera randomly cuts out at points, so I've missed the rest of the outline. I switched to a paler yellow wool here to add a bit of shading. This is the weld exhaust dye I mentioned earlier, and it's only a fraction paler than the outline, but I felt it was worth switching to this slightly paler yellow. To figure out the shading, I've looked at how the dog was carved in relief, as well as the use of different colours and animals in medieval bestiaries. The use of this shading adds depth and dimension to animals beyond what can be seen through the use of different thread directions, which we'll see examples of later. So here is shading in a bit of the head. So this is actually using a lot of the carving. It's got these lines across the face, highlighting the face, hence why I wanted to get this in here. The stitch that I've been using is the back stitch. So with this you put a stitch in, you move the thread back, poke it up through the thread stitch that you've just made and back in. I'm using this for both the outline and for filling in the figure. Backstitch was a very common form of stitch in this time period in the 12th century that I'm working with. The Bayeux tapestry stitch I believe has fallen out of use, hence why I'm sticking with the backstitch for all of the stitches in this dog. And we move on to shading in the back leg. So this is the leg that is behind the other. You can tell because the front leg you have the shoulder, so we want to put this in a blanket yellowy cream colour, so that exhaust weld, slightly paler than the outline to further highlight that this leg is behind the rest of the dog, give it that depth. So here's another bit where my camera cut out, but I've started outlining the areas of white. So the leg has been sectioned off, or the top part of the leg, and we've also put in a divide between the bottom and the top part of the neck. So the reason for this is we're going to have the thread going in different directions to symbolise how the fur is moving on the dog. The divide in the neck is actually kind of in reference to the original art, where you've got this line running down the dog which has these little spots in it, so I'm interpreting this as two different directions of thread. So this line here is going to mark the difference, where I've got one going one direction and one going the other. So we've started on the main body of the dog here, and this is a part where I've got the biggest amount of space in order to show how the thread is going in different directions. So I'm working on the bottom half here, and I wanted to get an angle that's following the shading behind the leg. So this is going from leg out an angle towards the tail, and it's just about going down at that angle, and when I get to the end where I've got to get to my border, the edge of the dog, or my middle point, you move over just a fraction. You don't want to go up through the same hole, you will undo your stitch. You want to get just close to the side, come up in through the line, either the edge or my center point, and then continue following in as close as possible to the line you've just come down. So this sets up a kind of inward sloping, which I will contrast to the top of the dog, which we shall see later. So having done the lower part of the dog, we are now moving to the upper part of the main body, and for this bit I've switched the stitch from being at that diagonal angle down to being a line that follows the body of the dog. This actually is mirroring how I've done some other work on this piece of sleeve. I've done a little wyvern, and in that the main body follows the tail round, and so here I'm echoing this. This will create a bit of harmony between the two figures, so tying in the whole piece as they have that echoing pattern of the stitching on the back. So embroidery in the 12th century may or may not have been separated by gender. We do know that in earlier periods women have been mentioned as embroiderers. We do have them by name, but then by the 13th century we have the formation of an embroiderers guild in Paris, which is our first reference, as far as I'm aware, to an embroiderers guild, and it details having only one male and one female apprentice, and there's also some indication that you have family businesses where both the husband and wife are embroiderers, indicating that there's possibly been a shift. It's been suggested that the later formation of the Guild of Embroiderers could be because embroidery was primarily a woman's craft. You do see other guilds forming in the 12th century, so this could explain its late addition to the guilds. But in the 12th century, it's possible that we don't necessarily have a gender division, or we're seeing that shift towards being primarily a female job to a more equally shared one. Right, So we're coming to a more difficult section where I remember to actually bring the needle closer to the camera. When filling in the backstitch, I like to keep as close as possible to the previous line of stitches. I often try to overlap with them, so when I come back in, I will go in slightly to the line that I've already done, not fully into it, but just slightly, and this helps keep the area appearing more uniform and more filled due to this overlapping on all sides. We have some time for a little history about the style of this little dog. The stonework is part of the columns on the entry to Kilpick Church, and stonework is part of the Herefordshire School of Carving, although the style can also be found in nearby Worcestershire and Shropshire. The Herefordshire School of Carving is dated to the early 12th century, and it has some rather interesting elements that make it stand out. It continues to make use of Celtic, folk or pagan themes, and it also shows an understanding of the more obscure parts of the Christian dogma, for instance the harrowing of hell, and even makes use of Plato, as noted by Mary Webb. These indicate that the designs may have been formed as part of an interplay between ecclesiastical scholars and stone carvers, so there may have been some ideas coming out from one side, they communicate to the other, therefore, and backwards and forwards. There are also elements such as the Sheelana gig, which today we might consider obscene and not something you'd find on a church, but they did make their way in. So we have a huge range of sort of things that you can draw on that aren't necessarily seen outside of this school of carving. As this embroidery is meant to represent someone who is a lord within Herefordshire, it's ideal to make use of this local style, which is found on churches which themselves were often paid for by local wealthy patrons. So the idea is here to tie in this local lord with the area and provide some regional distinction. Inevitably, in all my projects, I'll be distracted by this little monster. He decided to leave at my legs, so I thought I'd give him a bit of string to play with, but he's a bit camera shy, so this is all you're getting. He's done his best to help me with all my sewing projects and also dyeing projects, so I guess it was only time before he tried to turn his attention to embroidery, and you'll probably see him in a few more videos, because he does like to be involved. Okay, so I'm finishing up the main body of the dog, and soon you'll see that I'm going to end up with a bit more thread than I'd like. So instead of tying it off, cutting it, and then either discarding it or having a too small a piece to really work somewhere else, I switched to starting on the leg. The whole point of this is it means I can get a bit more done without using up that fibre. And once that's done, I switch to doing the dog's face. I do like to switch between doing larger pieces and smaller pieces. In a large cushion, I might actually be working on three different points at the same, three different parts of the same animal at the same time, just to keep my brain ticking over with something fresh. It's useful if you do struggle, if you lose motivation to have things like this, so I can definitely recommend either switching between things or focusing in on different areas. And here's another bit where I've slowed down as something goes wrong. I generally like to have large threads, but this does make them prone to breaking. When the thread goes through the fibre, it slightly uncurls sometimes and it can thin. I've just twisted the end here to help me thread it. Sometimes I'll wet it, but this can be a good method for thread pulling like this, or thread tied with something less friendly. So this I think could, well, this isn't one, but I have worked some with some thread on this that I think is possibly mordanted with copper or modified with copper, and I just didn't particularly fancy putting that in my mouth. So I've just turn this into something that I do as a way of threading things. Okay, so we're just moving on to the tail right now, and we're not doing anything too fancy here. We're keeping it the back stitch as we're doing with all of this dog, and we're just following the outline of the tail. So this is gonna work its way in towards the center. There won't be anything too exciting to look at in terms of how the thread position works, but it does work quite nicely when you're working on something like a tail. And then we move on to the head. So this is a bit more finicky as we're working with a small area. Okay, and now we're starting the leg of the dog. So we're starting on the top half, continuing we actually kind of started when we have that leftover bit of thread, and we're going to work our way in a circle to do the upper definition of the dog's muscle, and then we will just do a straight up and down when it comes to the lower part of the dog's leg. So while working on the leg, I will just talk a bit about some advice to people starting out with embroidery, specifically if you're doing historical embroidery. So look at designs and look for something that you find interesting, something that you would like to try your hand at, and then especially if you're taking, say, influence from bestiaries, look at how the body moves, hence why I've worked with a muscle on the dog's upper arm. If you're doing something like leaves, look at how the leaves, the veins of the leaves move out. Look at how colour is used. See if there are local styles, as is the case here, which you find interesting. I prefer knot work over vine work because I can't do leaves, so I tend to I quite like the Herefordshire style because it gives me a lot of Celtic knot work to work with, as well as these fantastic animals. Experiment and find a stitch that works for you as well. Backstitch is easy and is commonly used, so there's a benefit there. Okay, so now we're working on the chin of the dog, and surely we'll be doing the face, the ear, so this is just finishing off those last little bits of the dog. I did mention that I tend to go between big and small, but I do tend to work my way also down to the smaller, so I leave it towards the end so I can also do it if I want, do it if I have those small bits of thread that I still need to use up, or as here, those last little finicky bits that leave you ending on like a, wow, that was really quick to do, which is always a nice and good feeling to have. So we have the chin, we have the main part of the face, and we have the ear coming up. So here's the final product. We have the dog in its entirety. The tail isn't too exciting as the thread is going all in pretty much the same direction. There's no specific things going on here with how it's shaped, but we do have the chest, which does show that split between the top and the bottom, and we can see it much more clearly in the body of the dog, the whole body of the dog, where you've got that following it through from the centerpiece. You can see here in this picture we've got a final product with the dog and the wyvern. So you can see on the first side we've got wyverns, so we've got 3 wyverns in total and 1 dog. There's some similarities in the embroidery, how you're using the thread direction to create certain types of movement, especially between the two upper and lower bodies. We've got blue eyes, which didn't show up as well on the white dog. I probably should have used a slightly darker blue. And unlike the Herefordshire star, which has these little circles, little bezels in, I haven't gone for that, although there's always the option to later sew in some beads, but there's also a possibility that beads would quite easily be lost, so that's something to maybe look at a bit later. And see how well they do with the general wear and tear and whether beads are actually wanted themselves. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this and that you've got some ideas about doing your own embroidery, your own projects, and how to research into medieval styles and patterns and make them relevant to your area. Thank you for watching.